Chapter 1, The Impossible Fizz. Summer 1943. The heavy air of Tennessee clung to everything. The rusted barbed wire, the dirt paths, the rows of whitewashed barracks standing silent under the southern sun. Inside Camp Crossville, a young German soldier, 24 years old, captured in the deserts of Tunisia, lifted a cold glass bottle to his lips and felt the fizz burn across his tongue. It was alive, sparkling, biting, impossibly sweet. He swallowed once, then again as the bubbles danced up his nose. He laughed. Actually laughed, because it didn't taste like anything he knew. It tasted like nothing from war. For 2 years, he had lived on hunger, hard biscuits that broke like stone, ersatz coffee, a bitter, muddy brew of roasted barley that pretended to be warmth. In the desert, food was function, not pleasure. Every bite a necessity, every sip survival. But this was unnecessary. It was joy in a bottle. The American guard who handed it to him smiled and said, 5 cents. The same price, he added, that American children paid from their pocket money. The Germans stared. 5 cents for something like this? For something that seemed so impossibly luxurious? All across the United States that summer, hundreds of thousands of captured German soldiers would have the same moment of disbelief. 371,000 men, veterans of the Afrika Korps, of Rommel's once mighty army, now prisoners, standing under American skies, tasting something they couldn't have imagined even in victory. And in that first taste, the first crack appeared in the world they had been taught to believe in. Nazi propaganda had warned them that America was a nation of weakness, lazy, soft, driven by money, not strength. But the evidence before their eyes said otherwise. The Americans were everywhere, organized, confident, rich in everything that mattered. Their world ran on energy, on efficiency, on a strange kind of happiness that no German officer could quantify.
In the camps, the prisoners quickly learned that ice cream was not a rare indulgence. It was routine. That soft drinks were not reserved for the rich. They flowed freely, even in prison. That candy bars were so cheap, so ordinary, that guards handed them to prisoners as casually as they handed out cigarettes. To a man who had survived on crusts and substitutes, it was incomprehensible. For those who had been raised under scarcity, who had been told that sacrifice was noble, that deprivation was strength, this abundance was not just shocking. It was revelatory. Because what they were seeing wasn't just a wealth of food. It was the wealth of an entire civilization. Every bottle of Coca-Cola, every scoop of ice cream, every chocolate bar spoke of a vast machinery of industry and freedom, a system capable of producing not just what was needed, but what was desired. The arithmetic of abundance was being written before their eyes, not in the language of conquest or ideology, but in sweetness and satisfaction. It was written in chocolate and carbonation, in pies that steamed with sugar, in cones of melting ice cream passed over counters without a second thought. And as the weeks passed, the realization began to sink in. What they saw here was not luck, not greed, but the product of something far greater. A nation so powerful that it could afford to be generous. For the first time, they understood that their defeat might not have come from superior weapons or better strategy, but from something deeper, something structural, even spiritual. They had been conquered not by armies, but by abundance. Because while Germany had built walls of ideology and machines of war, America had built a civilization of plenty, a society that believed strength came not from taking, but from making. And as the fizz of Coca-Cola lingered on his tongue, the young German soldier looked around at his fellow prisoners, each holding the same brown bottle, each tasting the same strange sweetness, and thought, quietly, if this is what our enemy lives like, then everything we were told was wrong. That realization, simple, private, undeniable, marked the beginning of something the German High Command could never have imagined, an ideological collapse born not from bombs, but from sugar, milk, and ice.
Chapter 2, The First Taste of Defeat. In May 1943, the war in North Africa came to its final, exhausted end. The great German dream of conquest beneath the desert sun collapsed in a haze of dust and defeat. The Afrika Korps, Rommel's proud, battle-hardened army, laid down its weapons. 2 years of endless sandstorms, hunger, and heat had broken them. Their tanks were empty, their boots worn to shreds, their bodies carved thin by thirst. When the surrender came, nearly 250,000 men, Germans and Italians together, walked out of the desert and into captivity. Many expected the end to be cruel. They had seen what war could do to prisoners. They imagined barbed wire, starvation, and contempt. To them, the Americans were the enemy, faceless, mechanized, and merciless. But when the trucks rolled into the temporary camps near Tunis and Bizerta, the first thing they saw was not barbed wire or rifle butts. It was food. The Americans called them K-rations. Small, compact cardboard boxes printed with neat instructions. Breakfast, dinner, supper. To an American GI, they were a necessary evil, a bland, monotonous meal to be endured on the march. To a German soldier, they were a revelation. Inside those boxes were treasures. Crisp crackers, tins of processed cheese, a bar of chocolate, a fruit bar, packets of instant coffee, sugar tablets, chewing gum, and cigarettes. Always cigarettes. The German prisoners opened them in silence at first, uncertain whether it was some cruel joke. Then came the laughter, the disbelief. Some called for their comrades to look. Some pocketed the chocolate as though it were gold. Others stared at the cigarettes and whispered, "Ek tabak," real tobacco. To men who had grown used to imitation coffee made of roasted barley, to margarine that tasted of chemicals, to ersatz everything, this was nothing short of a miracle. And it didn't stop there. When the prisoners were processed to the larger holding camps in North Africa, before transport to America, the U.S. Army kitchens opened early each morning. From them came smells no German soldier had encountered in years. Hot oil, butter, sweet batter, and the faint warmth of maple syrup. The Americans served pancakes. With syrup, with eggs, with fresh milk. Some of the prisoners wept. Others refused to eat at first, convinced it was some sort of trick. One officer, a veteran of Tobruk, later told the Red Cross, "We expected to be starved as prisoners. Instead, the Americans fed us better than our own army ever had. That was the beginning of our education."
The Americans had not planned a lesson. There was no propaganda officer lecturing, no speeches about democracy or freedom. They were simply following the rules, the Geneva Convention, logistics, procedure. Feed the prisoners. Keep them healthy. Move them along. But every plate of food, every cigarette handed over, carried a message far more powerful than any speech. The world the Nazis had promised them, the world of German superiority and Western decadence, was an illusion. Because here, standing in enemy territory, they saw the truth with their own eyes. The Americans, so often mocked in German propaganda as weak and materialistic, were not weak at all. They were abundant. They had everything: food, fuel, machines, music, smiles. And they shared it without hesitation, even with their enemies. To men who had been taught that compassion was weakness, that strength was born from sacrifice, the very existence of this system, one that fed even its captives with care, was incomprehensible. Every bite of pancake, every swallow of milk, every puff of a cigarette challenged years of indoctrination. The Nazis had promised glory through hardship, purity through suffering, triumph through hate. But here was a nation that found its strength in the exact opposite, in generosity, in comfort, in the quiet dignity of plenty. As the first ships prepared to carry these prisoners across the Atlantic, many of them began to wonder, silently, privately, if perhaps their captors had discovered a better way to live. And that doubt, so small and quiet at first, would grow stronger with every mile that carried them closer to America.
Chapter 3. The Crossing. In the summer of 1943, the war took a strange and silent turn. Across the harbors of North Africa, the ports that had once echoed with artillery and the thunder of departing convoys now filled with a different sound. The shuffle of boots, the low murmur of men speaking in German, Italian, Austrian, Bavarian accents. They were prisoners now. The soldiers of the Afrika Korps, once the sharp edge of the Wehrmacht's pride, were herded in orderly columns toward the docks where enormous steel hulls waited under the glaring sun. The names painted on the bows were unfamiliar to them. Liberty ships. They had heard rumors that America could build a ship faster than Germany could repair one, that factories there ran day and night, that an entire fleet could be born from blueprints to water in less than 2 days. But now they saw it for themselves. The Liberty ships were not elegant. They were raw, functional, vast, the shape of efficiency itself. Rivets gleamed like rows of metal stars down their flanks. These were not ships of prestige. They were ships of purpose, built in an average of 42 hours. Each one was a declaration of what American power truly meant. Not aristocratic refinement, but unstoppable productivity. And now, those very ships, floating symbols of mass production, carried the defeated across the Atlantic, from the desert of Africa to the heart of the enemy's homeland. For most of the men, it was their first time seeing the ocean stretch endlessly in every direction. The Atlantic was immense and different. They slept in bunks stacked 3 high, the air thick with salt and engine oil, and the rhythm of the sea became the rhythm of their captivity. But even here, in this metal limbo between continents, the lesson of abundance continued. Each day, the American cooks prepared meals that defied everything the prisoners had expected. Breakfast, oatmeal with sugar, fresh bread, butter, jam, and coffee, real coffee, with milk. Lunch, roast beef or chicken, boiled potatoes, beans, cabbage, fruit. Dinner, soup, vegetables, more bread, more meat.
3 full meals a day. Nearly 3,500 calories, more than most civilians in Germany could dream of at the time. The prisoners ate in silence at first, unsure whether they were being tested. Then gradually, suspicion gave way to disbelief. "They feed us like kings," one man wrote in his journal. Another recorded, "I have not seen such bread since before the war." And sometimes, the most impossible luxury appeared: ice cream. It sounded like a rumor, but the ship's logs proved it true. On July 4, 1943, America's Independence Day, aboard the USS General M.B. Stewart, the German prisoners of war were served ice cream made fresh from the ship's own machine. There was symbolism in it, though none of the men understood it yet. The very idea that a ship in the middle of the ocean, a vessel built for war, carrying thousands of enemy soldiers, would devote its resources to creating a dessert was absurd. Yet there it was, cold, sweet, and unnecessary. They ate slowly, tasting each spoonful as if it were something sacred. For many, it was their first ice cream in years, for some, their first ever. The chill of it against their tongues, the softness as it melted, it carried no propaganda, no speech, no slogan. But it spoke volumes. It told them that America's strength was not rooted in domination, but in creation. That the same system capable of building a fleet of ships in 42 hours could also make time to feed its prisoners with dignity, even with sweetness. As the Liberty ships cut through the Atlantic swells, the prisoners began to sense that they were crossing more than an ocean. They were moving between worlds, from a continent of scarcity to one of abundance, from a regime of control to a society that overflowed with possibility. One soldier later recalled looking out over the waves and thinking that he was sailing not into captivity, but into the future. By the time they reached the shores of America, the land they had been taught to despise, they no longer knew exactly who their enemy was. Because the America they imagined was a myth, and the America that awaited them was something far more powerful.
Chapter 4. Arrival in the Land of Plenty. When the Liberty ships finally neared the American coast, dawn broke over a horizon unlike any they had ever seen. There was no destruction, no bombed-out silhouettes, no wreckage of war, only vast stretches of cranes, piers, and steel, a machine of peace and power that hummed with order. As the ships glided into Norfolk, Virginia, the German prisoners crowded along the railings. What they saw stunned them into silence. The docks seemed endless, miles upon miles of concrete and metal, stacked with crates, barrels, and cargo as far as the eye could see. Towering warehouses stood side by side, larger than any port facility in Hamburg or Bremen. Trains waited already loaded. Trucks rolled in lines so perfect they looked choreographed. The air vibrated with movement, not chaos, but coordination. It was an empire of logistics, the physical expression of a country that had learned to master production. Inside the warehouses, they caught glimpses of goods: candy bars, cigarettes, soft drinks, magazine, canned food, radios, shoes, fabric. Everything a human being could want, stacked and waiting. And all of it, they were told, was for sale at the same price everywhere in the nation. 5 cents for a bottle of Coca-Cola, 5 cents for a candy bar, 5 cents for a pack of gum. The number itself seemed absurd, as if the entire country ran on a kind of moral arithmetic of fairness, where even the smallest pleasures were made available to everyone. For men raised in a system that worshiped hierarchy and privilege, this equality of consumption, this democratic abundance, was a shock greater than defeat itself. Their journey inland only deepened the wonder. The prisoners were not herded into cattle cars or locked in dark freight wagons. They were loaded into passenger trains, clean, comfortable, with wide windows to watch the American landscape unfold. As the trains thundered through Virginia's green hills, through towns and farmlands untouched by war, they saw something else that left them speechless. Plenty. No ruins. No ration lines. No fear. Just fields of corn and tobacco, roads alive with cars, towns where shop windows gleamed with goods. In the dining cars, American soldiers and guards ate alongside them. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, vegetables, pie, coffee served hot with cream and sugar. At first, the prisoners thought it was some kind of display, a deliberate attempt to impress them. But it wasn't. It was simply routine, ordinary. This was what life in America was. When they finally arrived at the camps, places like Camp Crossville in Tennessee, Camp Shelby in Mississippi, Camp Algona in Iowa, they expected the illusion to end. But it didn't. It grew stronger. The camps were fenced, yes, and guarded. But inside those fences, they found a level of comfort they hadn't known even in their own barracks. Electric lights flickered on at the touch of a switch. Hot water poured from faucets without ration. Barracks were heated in winter. Flush toilets, a small luxury, but one that symbolized modernity itself, stood in every building. For men who had lived in dugouts and frozen forests, this was almost futuristic. But the greatest shock awaited them in a simple, unassuming building near the center of each camp, the Post Exchange, the PX. Here, American soldiers and now German prisoners could buy the same items found in stores across the United States. Shelves lined with soap, razors, toothpaste, candy bars, magazines, postcards, tobacco, and most importantly, Coca-Cola. Each prisoner earned 80 cents a day for their labor, a small fortune within the wire. A single day's pay could buy 16 bottles of Coca-Cola, or a dozen candy bars, or a week's worth of cigarettes. The sight of their captors handing them American money to buy American goods left many bewildered. Was this really captivity? Or had they somehow stumbled into a lesson about another kind of power, the kind that didn't need to assert itself through fear? Soon, Coca-Cola became more than a drink. It became a symbol. It represented something invisible yet undeniable, the idea that strength and freedom could coexist, that a society could be industrial and democratic, disciplined yet indulgent, rich but fair. Every bottle carried the same message, not through words but through sameness. The same drink, at the same price, for soldiers, children, and even prisoners of war. To the German mind, trained to see the world in ranks and hierarchies, this was unthinkable. Yet here it was, tangible, fizzy real. The more they drank it, the more they came to understand this was not propaganda. It was simply America being itself. And that, perhaps, was its most powerful weapon. Because behind the fences of their captivity, the prisoners of war were witnessing a kind of freedom that could not be commanded, only lived. And in every cold bottle of Coca-Cola, they tasted it.
Chapter 5, The Taste of Industrial Power. By 1943, the Coca-Cola Company was operating at a scale the world had never seen. 5 billion bottles poured from its plants that year alone, an ocean of sweetness flowing from the heart of American industry to every corner of the nation, and far beyond it. Even in wartime, even with millions of men under arms and factories devoted to tanks and planes, America still found time and energy to bottle happiness. Every prisoner of war camp received its share of that happiness, delivered by trucks that came like clockwork. Quartermaster records show the same pattern repeated week after week, 200, sometimes 300 cases, each filled with 24 bottles. A steady rhythm of refreshment that reached into the most remote corners of the country. To the German prisoners, it seemed impossible, a logistical miracle. The same red label, the same brown glass, the same sound when the cap was lifted. That hiss, that fizz, that sweetness, it never varied. A bottle opened in Maine was identical to one opened in Texas, or in a camp deep in the plains of Kansas. There was no room for error, no regional difference, no failure of supply. Every sip spoke of a system so vast and so confident that it could make perfection ordinary. To men trained in the myth of German superiority, it was unsettling. They had been told that Americans were disorganized, mechanical amateurs, incapable of discipline. Yet here was proof of a different kind of order, one that didn't depend on fear or control but on coordination, cooperation, and shared purpose. Coca-Cola was no longer just a drink. It was a revelation in glass form, democracy bottled. Each label read the same, each price the same, each bottle accessible to everyone from the wealthiest officer to the humblest laborer, to prisoners themselves. That sameness was more powerful than any speech. It whispered an undeniable truth: in America, equality wasn't just an idea. It was a system. The prisoners began to see this pattern everywhere. In the mess halls, in the PX stores, in the way food arrived on time, in the way everything, from bread to soap, seemed infinite and standardized. Then came the second shock, colder, sweeter, and far stranger. Ice cream. To most Germans, ice cream was a distant memory from before the war, a treat for children on summer Sundays, something rationing had long erased. To find it in prison camps, in the middle of a world war, was incomprehensible. But there it was. Camps with refrigeration equipment began to make their own, following recipes sent by the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. The flavors read like poetry from another world: chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, butter pecan. On hot afternoons, lines of prisoners stood under the sun, coins in hand, waiting for their turn at the PX window. 10 cents bought a paper cup of cold sweetness, a small miracle on a summer day in captivity.
At first, they thought it was a trick. Ice cream for prisoners? Impossible. But it wasn't a trick, it was policy. The U.S. Army considered ice cream essential for morale, not just for soldiers, but for anyone under its care. And so, the Germans watched as ice, salt, cream, and sugar, things they considered luxuries, were turned into joy. The process fascinated them. Hand crank machines churning slowly, frost forming on metal, the smell of vanilla drifting through the air. It was, to them, alchemy. In Germany, every gram of sugar was rationed. Every drop of milk was counted. Ice itself was precious. Yet here, in the land of their enemy, these things were used not for survival, but for pleasure. That realization cut deep. It overturned everything they believed about strength and power. To the Germans, ice cream became more than food. It became a symbol. Proof that a society could be powerful without cruelty, rich without conquest, disciplined yet full of joy. They had been taught that decadence was weakness. But here, in a place of captivity, they learned that happiness could be strength. Every spoonful carried the same quiet message as every bottle of Coca-Cola. Abundance could defeat ideology. The Americans didn't lecture or threaten. They didn't need to. They simply lived their values and served them one scoop at a time. By the summer of 1944, prisoners no longer spoke of their captors with hatred or fear. They spoke of them with confusion, admiration, and eventually understanding. For in a land where ice cream was a right and Coca-Cola constant, they began to glimpse a new idea of civilization, one where freedom didn't mean chaos, and comfort didn't mean weakness. In every camp, in every bottle and bowl, the taste of democracy lingered, cold, sweet, and unforgettable.
Chapter 6: Sugar, Waste, and Wonder. If anything revealed the soul of America, it was sugar. Not steel, not tanks, not even the Liberty ships that crossed the Atlantic, but sugar. In Germany, sugar was life itself, rationed by the gram. 280 grams per month, if it could be found. Mothers measured it like medicine, counting every spoonful. Cakes had disappeared. Candy was a memory. Even coffee had become bitter without it. But in America, even in wartime, even in prison camps, sugar was everywhere. It sat in great white bowls on mess hall tables, so common that no one thought twice about it. Soldiers stirred it into their coffee. Prisoners poured it over their cereal. Bakers used it freely in cakes, cookies, pies, luxuries that Germans had not seen in years. Quartermaster records told the story better than any testimony could. Each camp received shipments of refined sugar by the sack, 100 pounds at a time, week after week. To the Americans, it was logistics. To the Germans, it was a miracle. One incident at Camp Aliceville, Alabama, would stay with many prisoners for the rest of their lives. The southern summer was hot, thick with humidity. One morning, several hundred pounds of sugar hardened into a solid mass. It could have been steamed and reused. It could have been salvaged. In Germany, it would have been guarded like gold. But the American staff didn't bother. They simply threw it out, and ordered more. The German kitchen workers stood silent, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. To them, it wasn't arrogance. It was power. The power to waste. In that single act, they saw what no lecture could explain, that America's strength was not measured in scarcity, but in abundance. A country that could discard what others treasured was a country that had mastered production itself. Sugar became more than sweetness. It became a symbol of industrial democracy, of a nation that could create enough for everyone, and still have plenty left over. And then there was chocolate. Before the war, chocolate had been a delicacy in Germany. A treat for children, a luxury for the wealthy. During the war, it vanished entirely, reserved for officers and the very rich. But in America, chocolate was everywhere. Factories in Pennsylvania, Illinois, and California ran day and night, producing millions of bars each month. Hershey, Mars, Nestle, names that meant nothing to most Germans, became symbols of an unimaginable world. The US military alone bought 380 million pounds of chocolate during the war years. It filled rations, Red Cross parcels, and PX shelves.
In the camps, chocolate bars sold for 5 or 10 cents, the same price charged anywhere in the country. Some guards handed them out freely. For the German prisoners, each bar was a revelation wrapped in silver paper. It wasn't just a taste, though that first bite of real milk chocolate, melting on the tongue after years of deprivation, was unforgettable. It was the idea behind it. Americans didn't hoard. They shared. They didn't steal or ration pleasure. They mass-produced it. They didn't guard their comfort jealously. They multiplied it. And in that, the prisoners saw the secret of American strength. It wasn't built on conquest or cruelty, but on an almost childlike faith that there could always be more. More food, more production, more comfort, more life. To the German mind, trained in fear of shortage, that faith was impossible. Yet here, surrounded by proof of it, they began to understand. Each spoonful of sugar, each piece of chocolate, became a small act of re-education, not through lectures or punishment, but through taste and contrast. They had been raised to believe that only discipline and suffering forge greatness. But in America, they found another truth, that generosity could build strength and abundance could build unity. The sweetness they tasted was more than flavor. It was the end of an illusion. The world the Nazis promised had starved them. The world they had been taught to despise had fed them, and done so without hatred, without pride, without even realizing the lesson it was teaching. It was a quiet kind of victory, one measured not in battles, but in sugar bowls and candy wrappers. And as they ate, the German prisoners of war came to see what power truly meant. Not the ability to take, but the ability to give without fear of running out.
Chapter 7, Holidays of Generosity. Thanksgiving, 1943. The war was far from over. Across the Atlantic, Europe still burned. But in America, on that late November day, something extraordinary happened. From the snows of Minnesota to the pine fields of Alabama, from dusty Texas to the farmlands of Pennsylvania, an entire nation paused and gave thanks. And even behind barbed wire, that spirit reached those who had once sworn to destroy it. Across every prisoner of war camp in the United States, the same miracle unfolded, long wooden tables, lined with white plates and steaming trays of food. The menu did not change, no matter the place, no matter the prisoner. Roast turkey, browned and glistening. Bread stuffing rich with sage and onion. Mashed potatoes smoothed with butter and drowned in gravy. Sweet potatoes glazed with syrup. Cranberry sauce, tart and red. Pumpkin pie, spiced with cinnamon and cream. Coffee served hot, with real milk and sugar. For hundreds of thousands of men, Germans, Italians, Austrians, it was the first true feast they had seen in years. To them, it felt impossible. They were prisoners, the defeated, the enemy. Yet they were fed the same meal that American soldiers ate, the same meal that American families were sharing in their homes that very night. It wasn't propaganda. It wasn't a show for the cameras. It was simply how things were done. The United States had decided, from the beginning, that its treatment of prisoners would reflect its values, not its fears. Geneva Convention rules were followed not reluctantly, but proudly. In America's eyes, decency was not charity, it was law, and more than law, it was identity. And so, on Thanksgiving, 1943, mercy was baked into the crust of every pie. For the German prisoners, the experience was surreal. They had been raised to believe that enemies were subhuman, that compassion was a sign of weakness. Yet here was the strongest industrial nation on earth, serving them turkey and pie without hatred or hesitation. Letters from prisoners captured the confusion. "In Germany, we would never have treated our captives this way," one wrote. "Here, they treat us like men." That was the education continuing, quiet, relentless, unstoppable. Not taught in classrooms, but in kitchens. And then came Christmas.
As winter swept across the camps, America's spirit of generosity deepened. Civilian groups began to visit, bearing gifts and greetings. Church congregations organized drives for the enemy within. Local families baked cookies and bread, wrapped them in paper, and delivered them through the camp gates. In Oklahoma, townspeople from miles around baked for their prisoners, dozens of cakes and hundreds of cookies. Each box signed, "From the people of Perryton," or "Merry Christmas" from Alabama. In Texas, small-town churches arrived with carols and homemade candy. Prisoners received stockings filled with sweets, pencils, and handwritten notes wishing them peace. Some camps even arranged Christmas trees, trimmed and lit, in the dining halls. The guards sang carols with the prisoners. The food was plentiful, the mood quiet, reflective. For a few hours, war seemed to pause. Many German soldiers wept. They could now understand a world where enemies celebrated their holidays together, where the victors shared joy instead of revenge. Their ideology had taught them that mercy was decay, that compassion weakened nations, that pity undermined power. But here, they witnessed something that shattered that illusion completely. America's strength came not from cruelty, but from confidence. A nation so secure in its abundance, so certain of its ideals, that it could afford to show kindness even to those who had sought its destruction. It was a moral victory far greater than any won on the battlefield. And for many of the men behind those fences, it was the beginning of transformation. They began to question the world they had left behind, the hatred they had been taught, and the meaning of the word enemy. Years later, when they returned home, they would tell their families that the true power of America was not in its armies or factories, but in its humanity. That winter of 1943, as snow fell softly over the barbed wire and the glow of Christmas trees flickered through the barracks, something unthinkable happened. The enemy was treated as a guest, and in that gesture, simple, generous, profoundly human, a civilization revealed at heart.
Chapter 8, Work and Discovery. By 1944, the tide of war had turned, and America was straining under its own success. Millions of men were overseas, fighting in Europe and the Pacific, leaving gaps in the fields and factories that fed the arsenal of democracy. The solution arrived behind barbed wire. Under the terms of the Geneva Convention, German prisoners of war could be put to work, not as slaves, but as paid laborers. And so, the same men who had once marched under Rommel and flown under the swastika were sent out across the American heartland to fill the empty spaces left by war. They went to orchards and canneries, to sawmills and rail yards, to sugar beet fields and packing plants. They wore their faded uniforms, but their guards were few, sometimes only one man with a rifle, often none at all. And what they saw changed them forever. In Michigan, the air was heavy with the scent of cherries. Thousands of acres of trees bent under the weight of fruit, deep red, shining in the sun. The prisoners picked from dawn to dusk, baskets filling faster than they could count. But what stunned them most was not the work, it was where the fruit was going. Not to the front. Not to rationing depots or military supply trains. But to ice cream factories, bakeries, soda fountains. Tons of cherries destined not for survival, but for delight, to top sundaes, to fill pies, to swirl into milkshakes. To German eyes, this was unthinkable. In their homeland, fruit was dried, hoarded, rationed. Here, it was decoration. In the canneries, the lesson grew sharper. Lines of women, laughing, chatting, worked beside conveyor belts loaded with peaches, pears, and beans. The Germans watched as inspectors pulled aside entire trays of produce. The reason? The fruit was slightly bruised, a little too small, imperfect in shape. Perfectly good food, tossed aside because it wasn't beautiful enough. The prisoners stared in disbelief. To them, it was waste. To the Americans, it was quality control. And yet, beneath that act of rejection lay another kind of abundance, the luxury to demand perfection. In Nebraska, on the vast plains, they worked the sugar beet fields. Machines roared through the soil, harvesting more in a single season than entire German provinces could produce in a year. The sheer productivity seemed godlike, endless rows of crops, stretching to the horizon. When trucks came to haul the beets away, the Germans marveled at the size of the loads, at the ease with which the Americans worked. Every step of the process was mechanized, industrialized, efficient.
They realized that America's abundance was not an accident. It was engineered, the result of machines, systems, and a culture that valued invention over hierarchy. For the first time, they saw where all the sugar, the pies, the ice cream, and the Coca-Cola came from. It wasn't magic. It was machinery. It was organization. It was freedom translated into production. But perhaps the deepest shock came not in the fields or factories, but in the towns. During breaks, they watched American life unfold around them. Children in schools eating lunches richer than what German officers had once enjoyed. Milk, meat, vegetables, and on Fridays, ice cream. They watched families in diners, ordinary people, not officers or elites, sitting at counters lined with chrome, ordering whatever they wanted. A hamburger for 25 cents, a Coca-Cola for 5, an ice cream sundae for 25. There were no class distinctions at the counter. Factory workers sat beside bank clerks, farmers beside salesmen. Everyone paid the same price, received the same meal, and was treated with the same courtesy. It was equality made visible, democracy you could eat, for men raised in a society built on rank and privilege. Where even food was political, this sight was revolutionary. They had fought for a system that worshipped hierarchy, that demanded obedience and sacrifice for the few above. Yet here was a system that gave comfort and choice to the many below. It was not weakness that made such a society generous. It was confidence. The more they saw, the more they began to understand that America's strength did not come from uniformity of thought or strict control, but from the freedom to innovate, to choose, to enjoy. A prisoner in Illinois later wrote, "We came to pick apples and left with a new idea of what a country could be." By the end of that year, few still believed the lies of the Reich. They had seen too much, too many full plates, too many free people, too many small, daily proofs that democracy could feed the world. And so, through fields and factories, through orchards and diners, the silent re-education of an entire army continued. One cherry, one hamburger, one bottle of Coca-Cola at a time.
Chapter 9, Statistics of Power. The numbers told the truth, cold, undeniable, devastating to everything the Nazi regime had ever claimed about itself and about the world beyond its borders. In 1944 alone, America consumed 7 million tons of sugar, 380 million pounds of chocolate, 5 billion bottles of Coca-Cola, over 500 million gallons of ice cream. Each number was more than a statistic, it was a declaration of power, of abundance, of a civilization that had mastered not only the art of war, but the art of living. To the German prisoners, these figures were incomprehensible. They had come from a continent choking under ration cards, where mothers stood in bread lines for hours, where a pound of sugar was worth a day's wages, if it could be found at all. They had fought for a system that promised strength through sacrifice, purity through deprivation. Yet here, the supposed decadent enemy was not only winning the war but drowning in sweetness. They saw it in their own bodies. Medical records from dozens of camps revealed an astonishing pattern. Within months of capture, German prisoners had gained weight. Men who had arrived gaunt and hollow-cheeked from North Africa or Europe grew strong again on American rations. Their faces filled out. Their skin lost its grayness. Their energy returned. While German civilians starved under bombed-out cities, their captured soldiers in the enemy's care grew healthier, stronger, even happier. And soon, those same prisoners began doing something that would have been unthinkable to them months earlier, sending food home. From their modest camp wages, 80 cents a day, they purchased chocolate bars, coffee, canned meats, powdered milk, soap, and cigarettes from the camp exchanges. Packed neatly in boxes, these goods were sent across the ocean through the Red Cross, addressed to mothers, wives, and children still living under the shadow of the Reich. By the war's end, over 11 million parcels had been sent from America to Germany. 11 million packages of abundance, crossing from captor to captive, from freedom to tyranny, from plenty to want. Each box was a quiet act of reversal. The soldiers who had once fought to conquer the world now relied on their conquerors to feed their families. It was the ultimate humiliation for the Reich, a defeat not just of armies, but of ideology. For all its slogans about superiority, the Nazi regime could not feed its own people. It could not provide comfort, sweetness, or joy. It had built monuments and weapons, but not bakeries and dairies. Its empire was built on fear and hunger.
America's empire, if it could be called that, was built on plenty. An empire of factories and farms, of soda fountains and ice cream parlors, of shared meals and common dreams. Every chocolate bar sent home was a message written in sugar. Everything you were told is a lie. A prisoner at Camp Hearn, Texas, later wrote, "We came here believing we were the master race, but the real masters were the ones who could make chocolate by the ton and give it away without hate." The contrast was too sharp to ignore. In Germany, obedience had been bought through scarcity, through fear of losing even the smallest comfort. In America, loyalty seemed to spring from confidence, from the certainty that there would always be more, that the nation's strength was not finite, but self-renewing. Even the American workers the prisoners saw, ordinary men and women in canneries and factories, seemed to live better than many German officers. They owned cars, radios, refrigerators. Their children were healthy and well-fed. And now, the German soldiers were sending pieces of that world back home, literal fragments of democracy, wrapped in brown paper and twine, crossing the ocean of families who have been taught to hate the people who sent them. No speech, no pamphlet, no classroom could have broken Nazi ideology as effectively as that single living contradiction, that the enemy fed them and through them their nation. In the quiet of the barracks, some prisoners began to talk about what it all meant, about what kind of country could produce so much and still remain free, about what kind of government trusted its people enough to let everyone, from farmer to prisoner, taste the same abundance. They had been conquered, yes, but not by tanks or bombs. They had been conquered by plenty. And as they packed another box of chocolate and coffee to send home, they began to understand the simplest truth of all, that power rooted in fear collapses, but power rooted in creation endures.
Chapter 11, Returning Home. When the prisoners finally returned home in 1946, the war was over, but the ruins still smoked. Germany was a landscape of ash and silence. Cities were hollow shells, railways torn apart, fields scarred and empty. Hunger hung in the air like dust. And then, into this world of loss, came the men who had been prisoners in America. They stepped off the trains heavier, cleaner, and healthier than when they had left. Their uniforms were worn but mended, their faces full, their eyes steady. They looked like men from another planet, one where the war had never reached. Waiting for them were wives and children, hollow-cheeked and pale, their clothes patched, their hands trembling with exhaustion. The sight was almost too much to bear. The returning soldiers had lived in abundance, their families had survived on hunger. Many could not find words for the divide between what they had seen and what they now faced. At first, the stories they told seemed unbelievable. Ice cream every week, Coca-Cola flowing freely, chocolate in every camp, milk in coffee, hot water, clean clothes, soft bread, fruit, cigarettes, music. It sounded like fantasy or propaganda in reverse. Their families could not imagine a world where prisoners were fed meat, where guards laughed with captives, where sugar was poured without measure, where even the enemy's enemy ate well. The returning men brought proof. In their rucksacks they carried gifts, bars of chocolate wrapped in American foil, cans of coffee, soap, cigarettes, tins of condensed milk, treasures in a starving nation. For children who had grown up knowing only rationing and bomb shelters, a piece of Hershey's chocolate was more than food, it was a glimpse of another universe. The stories spread through towns and villages. Stories of the clean barracks, the organized kitchens, the PX stores filled with candy and Coca-Cola, the Americans' strange obsession with fairness and abundance. It became clear to many that everything they had been told, about decadence, about democracy, about weakness, had been a lie. The United States, they now knew, was not a land of corruption and chaos. It was a nation built on work, on machines, on confidence, a society that had managed to make joy itself into an industry.
And most of all, it was a country that had treated its prisoners not with cruelty, but with dignity. For the men who had been raised in a system that equated compassion with weakness, this was a final revelation, that kindness could be a form of power. In the years that followed, as Germany split in two and the ruins began to turn into scaffolding, many of these former prisoners found themselves drawn toward the American vision of the future. They understood something their countrymen did not. Not yet. They had seen it with their own eyes. Prosperity did not require oppression. Strength did not require fear. A nation could be mighty not because it conquered others, but because it created more food, more ideas, more freedom. When the Marshall Plan was announced, promising aid to rebuild the broken nations of Europe, many of these men were its quiet advocates. They knew the generosity behind it was real. They had tasted it. In small towns across West Germany, they became the living link between two worlds. They helped rebuild roads, factories, and farms, often using techniques they had learned in captivity. They spoke of efficiency, of standardization, of American machinery and methods. They wrote to their former guards, to farmers who had hired them, to families who had shared their tables. They had entered the camps as enemies and left them as witnesses to a different kind of civilization. Years later, when journalists asked them what changed their minds, many answered simply, Coca-Cola, ice cream, fairness. Behind those simple words was a profound truth. In the prison camps of America, they had learned that abundance could educate, that generosity could defeat hate, and that freedom, real freedom, was not chaos, but confidence. The war had ended in ruins. But from those ruins, a new understanding began to rise, that true strength lies not in conquest, but in creation. And so, the men who once carried rifles to the Reich returned to help build the factories, the homes, and the cities of a new Germany, one founded not on fear, but on faith and possibility. They had been conquered by weapons on the battlefield. But in the long memory of history, it was not America's guns that changed them. It was its ice cream, its Coca-Cola, its chocolate, and its quiet, unstoppable abundance. That was how democracy won the war, not just through victory, but through generosity.
Chapter 12, The Legacy of Sweetness. Coca-Cola returned to West Germany in 1949, fizzing like a symbol of rebirth. The red and white logo, once glimpsed only in American prison camps, now appeared in the windows of shops rebuilt from rubble. Every bottle cap that popped open seemed to echo a promise. The war was over, and something new was beginning. Ice cream parlors soon followed, gleaming counters of chrome and glass modeled after the American soda fountains the former prisoners remembered so vividly. Young couples crowded around tall sundaes layered with syrup and whipped cream, the air filled with laughter and the hum of jukeboxes. For the first time in a decade, sweetness was no longer a memory, it was the taste of normal life. Candy bars, chewing gum, chocolate, all became emblems of freedom. Children who had grown up under rationing could now unwrap a piece of the modern world, one that sparkled and promised abundance. In every bite, they tasted the future their fathers had once glimpsed through the wire fences of American camps. Many of those former POWs recognized what others could not yet see. These weren't just products, they were messages. Coca-Cola, Hershey's, Wrigley's gum, they represented an idea of life built on choice, comfort, and confidence. The men who had once labored in American farms and factories understood this deeply. They returned home as unlikely missionaries of modernity. Some opened import businesses, bringing in American foods, drinks, and packaging methods. Others worked in logistics, in retail, in advertising, helping to rebuild a nation that now measured strength not in tanks or rifles, but in production and consumption. They spoke about standardization, about supply chains, about how the same bottle could be made identical in 100 places, and how that sameness was not a weakness, but a symbol of stability. From these lessons came the supermarket revolution. By the mid-1950s, new stores rose across West Germany, bright, orderly aisles stocked with every imaginable good. Shelves lined with canned fruit, coffee, and chocolate bars. Refrigerators humming with milk and ice cream. Rows of soda bottles glinting under fluorescent lights. It was abundance made visible, a cathedral of plenty.
And behind this transformation were men who had once worn the uniform of the defeated. They had stacked shelves in American camps. Seeing how consumers chose freely, how variety could build loyalty, and how prosperity could unite a people more effectively than any flag or slogan. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, that economic peace was built not on control, but on confidence, that when citizens buy freely, they believed in the system that allowed it. In their quiet way, they helped rewrite the soul of a nation. The Germany that rose from the ruins was not the Germany that had fallen. It was pragmatic, productive, and eager to participate in a world where power came from creation, not conquest. As the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, began to bloom. Those same former prisoners watched the factories roar back to life, the shops fill, the wages rise. They saw children eating ice cream on the streets of Hamburg, families drinking Coca-Cola in Munich, students carrying chocolate bars in their bags. And in those moments, they understood something profound. They brought a small piece of America home with them, not its politics or its armies, but its spirit. They had learned that democracy could be sweet, that freedom could be fizzy, and that joy itself could be mass-produced. In the end, the transformation that began behind barbed wire in 1943 did not stop when the gates opened. It spread through products, through culture, through memory, until an entire nation learned what those men had already discovered in captivity, that the truest victory of the war was not destruction, but the ability to create so much that even your enemies could share in it.
Chapter 13, Tasting Freedom. Years later, in interviews and memoirs, the former prisoners spoke with a tone of awe that time had not dimmed. They did not recall their captivity with bitterness, but with wonder, as if they had glimpsed another world through the fences, one more powerful than the armies that had defeated them. One remembered the first time he held a Coca-Cola bottle, condensation beating on the glass under the Tennessee sun. It was like drinking the future, he said. Sweet, unnecessary, and available to anyone. That drink contained everything Nazi Germany wasn't: abundant, democratic, joyful. Another recalled the taste of ice cream, the laughter of the American guards, the music that drifted from the camp radios. We expected to defeat a weak America, he said quietly. Instead, we found a nation that could give ice cream to its enemies. These moments, simple, ordinary, carried the weight of revelation. For men who had grown up under scarcity and control, they revealed a civilization built on trust, not fear. A system that believed in giving more, not withholding. In the world they had come from, food was power, sugar was privilege, and joy was rationed. In the world they discovered, comfort was shared, pleasure was permitted, and even the defeated could taste it. They began to see what their captors never meant to teach, that true strength did not come from domination, but from generosity. That abundance itself was an argument, more persuasive than any leaflet, louder than any speech. Each scoop of ice cream, each bottle of Coke, each candy bar, these were quiet weapons, soft symbols that cut deeper than propaganda. They told of a society so confident in its wealth, so sure of its system, that it could afford kindness without fear. When the war had begun, these men believed in hierarchy, in the idea that some lives mattered more than others. But in the American camps, they saw a different logic at work: the equality of access, the democracy of everyday life. In a bottle of soda priced the same for everyone, soldier, civilian, or prisoner, they saw the practical expression of liberty. In the taste of sugar freely given, they sensed the moral confidence of a nation unafraid of sharing its good fortune. Years later, they would tell their children and grandchildren about it. Not about the battles or the desert or the surrender, but about Coca-Cola and ice cream. About the miracle of abundance. About the realization that a society could be strong not because it ruled others, but because it made enough for everyone. And perhaps that was America's quietest victory of all. Not the defeat of an army, but the conversion of minds, one sweet, fizzy, melting lesson at a time.
Chapter 14, Victory Through Generosity. Historians would later call it the most successful re-education in history. Not because it was planned, but because it was lived. There were no slogans, no forced confessions, no indoctrination halls. Only full plates, cold drinks, and the quiet rhythm of ordinary abundance. 3 meals a day, unlimited sugar, cold drinks in summer, ice cream on the 4th of July. For the men who had marched beneath the swastika, these were not trivial comforts. They were revelations. Each small kindness was a contradiction to everything they had been taught. Every warm meal under the American flag dissolved another layer of the lies they had grown up believing. About decadence, about weakness, about freedom. They began to see that what their leaders had called corruption was, in truth, confidence. What they had mocked as softness was, in fact, strength. America, they realized, was powerful precisely because it didn't fear generosity. It could waste without collapse, share without losing, and feed its enemies without hesitation. Because it trusted the foundations that made such acts possible. Its power was not guarded by ideology, but sustained by production, organization, and a belief that prosperity grew when it was shared. The prisoners who once fought for empire began to grasp a different kind of empire. One of refrigerators, factories, and supermarkets. A freedom measured not by conquest, but by choice. They had seen how a nation could make plenty seem effortless, and how that effortlessness became a kind of moral authority. When they spoke of it years later, they spoke with quiet reverence, not for the weapons that defeated them, but for the society that absorbed them without hate. They had entered captivity as soldiers of a totalitarian state. They left it as witnesses to a democracy so sure of itself that it needed no cruelty to prove its dominance. In the end, America's greatest lesson to its prisoners was not written in words, but in sugar and milk, in Coca-Cola and chocolate, in ice cream melting beneath the southern sun. It was a lesson that generosity could be as disarming as any weapon. That kindness, multiplied by production, could change the world. They understood, at last, that power built on compassion endures longer than power built on fear. That a nation capable of feeding its enemies had already won far more than the war. It had won the argument for civilization itself.
Chapter 15, The Sweet Victory. By the end of their captivity, the German prisoners no longer wondered how America had won the war. They no longer asked how a young, distant nation could overcome an empire that had conquered Europe. They had seen the answer with their own eyes, not in the might of machines or the precision of armies, but in the effortless confidence of everyday life. The true weapon of democracy wasn't the tank or the bomb. It wasn't the factories that never slept or the endless convoys crossing the Atlantic. It was simpler, quieter, and infinitely more enduring. It was the Coca-Cola bottle and the ice cream scoop. Symbols of a civilization so rich in both material and moral strength that it could turn even captivity into comfort, even defeat into dignity. Those small moments, the hiss of a soda cap, the clink of a spoon in a glass dish, the laughter of guards and prisoners sharing the same sweetness, became the silent chorus of a larger truth. That democracy's greatest defense was its ability to make happiness seem ordinary. When those men returned home, they carried that lesson with them like a secret map of the future. They remembered the taste of Coca-Cola on their tongues, the cold shock of ice cream melting in the Tennessee heat, the impossible abundance that had surrounded them. To them, these were not luxuries, they were revelations. Proof that a society could be strong because it cared for comfort, powerful because it trusted its people with pleasure. They spoke of it not as nostalgia, but as conviction. They had seen a better world, one that did not need to conquer others to prove its greatness. A world where work built plenty, and plenty built peace. And so, when they rebuilt their shattered homeland, they built it in the image of what they had witnessed: factories humming with productivity, stores overflowing with choice, streets filled with the scent of coffee, chocolate, and fresh bread. They built a democracy not just of laws, but of daily life, of food, fairness, and freedom. Because in the end, the war had not been won only on battlefields. It had been won in the kitchens and canteens, in the PX counters and the soda fountains, in the quiet miracle of a bottle of Coke and a bowl of ice cream shared under the same sun by former enemies. It was there, in that simple act of abundance, that the most powerful message of the 20th century was written: that freedom, when shared, could do what fear never could, it could change the human heart.